This is the future.
Hello, I'm Edwin Rydberg, and you're listening to the Alternate Futures Podcast, where we chat with indie science fiction creators about their work, the world, and anything else in between. Today, I'm here with Bill Patenaude. Bill is an indie author from West Warwick, Rhode Island. He's a mechanical engineer and holds a Master of Arts in Theology. He's a longtime employee of Rhode Island's Department of Environmental Management and has been speaking and writing about the intersection of faith and ecology since 2004. In 2018, Bill published his debut novel, A Printer's Choice, which uses the popular genres of science fiction and murder mystery to examine the intersection of faith, philosophy, and the power of free will. Set in 2088 in a world damaged by war and eco-crises, the novel asks important questions about the choices humanity is making today, why we are making them, and how we can choose to make a better world here and now. Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining me in Old England from New England. The wonders of modern technology.
It is awesome to be here, Edwin. Thank you so much for the invitation and for making the time. This is a joy.
Oh, you're most welcome. So, engineering, ecology, and theology. I got to start there. That's a strange intersection. So you did a mechanical engineering initially, and just so why? What interested you about mechanical engineering then?
Well, as a sci-fi reader throughout my boyhood and my teens, I was enamored with the space program and with the notion of technical progress. And so I had two general career paths planned for the engineering degree. First of all, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then my dad sat me down and said, look, you're good with science, you're good with math. You should really think about engineering because it's always a job. The job market's always there. So I did, and I chose mechanical engineering. And I wanted to go into either one of two things. I wanted to do either build rockets with NASA or do really cool special effects engineering for the motion picture technology. I ended up working for a defense subcontractor working on nuclear submarines, didn't really find a lot of joy in that, and ended up in the environmental regulatory world, which is not something I planned. In fact, as you're asking the question, I was almost laughing to myself because it does seem quite obvious that I did not have a very good career path planned from my youth. So as a young man, I chose engineering, mechanical engineering, and I value that education so much because it really helped teach me how to think in a way and help me organize myself and plan, execute, and process lots of information. So it's been great.
I can appreciate that for sure with my own science background. Even if you don't stay in the field, you still you get the benefits of the thought processes and
Correct.
the structure. Yeah, your engineering definitely shows through in your book, which we'll get to in a little bit. So how did you fall into ecology then? Did you didn't like your nuclear engineering job, so you were looking around for something else?
Yeah, at the time it was not one of the best times of my life because it was my first job out of college, and I'm thinking that this is a harbinger of things to come. I went into the wrong vocation. I shouldn't be an engineer. I don't like what I do, which of course is, a young man's experience is very limited. So I had run into a consultant that I was friendly with, had no clue that he was doing consulting with the state environmental regulatory agency. And I told him what a difficult time I was having because I was kind of pitching some job questions off of him. And he said, well, listen, I'm actually doing consulting at the Rhode Island DEM. They're hiring engineers right now. You should put in an application. And Edwin, the weird thing is I love the environment. I'm a hiker, environmental advocate. You would have thought that I would have put those two pieces together, engineering and my love of the environment. And it took someone else to do that for me. Sent in the application, got 3 job offers and have been there. It'll be 33 years next month.
Wow. 33 years.
Correct.
Basically, I think of that as around the time of the Rio summit in the early 90s then.
Yeah.
And so which almost everyone seems to have forgotten about in light of the Paris Accords. But so what have you seen change in this world of the environmental awareness since that time then? Has there been a big change, or is it just all talk by politicians?
In a way, I haven't seen much. There's a lot of talk by advocates. There's a lot of talk by politicians. I was on a radio show talking about environmental policies that the recently elected Biden administration, this is several months ago, was going to put into place. And that was one of my comments, that that speech could have been written 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So on that level, I would say that there's not very much. However, the big factor that's a lot of people aren't paying attention to is that a lot of the private sector is beginning to take it seriously. And it's not so much that they want to just advertise about it to get customers, but a lot of big power companies are taking climate change and the whole transition to green energy very seriously. In some of my environmental advocacy work, we've worked with some huge international energy companies, and they have robust green energy programs because they see it as a way to make, it's capitalism, to make a profit. But the other industry that's really that has a say in this is the insurance industry. They're terrified of what could happen. So that is the big change, that the private sector really, in many levels, is making steps towards moving towards a more green economy, as it were, cleaner energy or renewable energy, or at least, if you don't like those terms, moving away from fossil fuels. Maybe not completely, maybe not tomorrow, but moving in that direction. So that's the big thing that's changed.
So kind of the money is caught up with the issue in a way.
Reality is setting in, yes.
So you mentioned the insurance agencies, but apart from them, which they're understandable, of course, do you think it's a matter of the bureaucracy has been put in place now to help those companies, or perhaps there's now more green money available, or the technology has improved to the point where it's more feasible?
That is an excellent question, and I would say you've hit on probably the trinity, if I can, of what is prompting where we're moving in the private sector. Certainly, technologies are well ahead of where they were. Certainly government policies, international, national, even local. Certainly the advocacy world has been eager to move, divest, that type of thing. But it's the very thing that I've been writing about since the early 2000s, which is the faith component of it. Faith leaders are more and more engaged. Certainly, my specialty is the Catholic engagement, the Roman Catholic engagement of ecology, but the Eastern Orthodox as well, in some ways early on in the 90s especially. But you had, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now of course Pope Francis. So they have added a certain moral voice to the equation that advocates have really latched onto and are eager to connect with. And that's really helped them message with the private sector and government. So it's sort of like all the voices are coming together. So, and to your question, that's another thing that's changed as well.
The whole shepherding of the earth kind of thing would seem to come naturally to religion in that regards.
From the Judeo-Christian point of view, it is a foundational revelation in the book of Genesis. It is all throughout the Old Testament, the glory of creation. And then from a Christian perspective, the very fact that Christians say that the word of God became flesh, became a human, all of the things that make up a human embryo, water, minerals, electrical, chemical signals, all of the things of creation entered into that. It ennobles creation in a way that the secular world doesn't always have a language for. So it has always been part of the Christian tradition, and we could do a whole podcast on that. And certainly in the 70s and 80s, John Paul II really added his voice to it because the issues were just becoming so apparent.
And that leads us nicely into your own kind of religious awakening, I suppose. So you said you were religious when you were young, or at least you were involved in the church, and then you left and then returned.
I was, made my confirmation. I didn't really want to make my confirmation. I was 15 years old, told my parents that, and here I am, the sci-fi reader, and reading Arthur C. Clarke. And, there's a lot of atheistic voices there. And although, oddly enough, I was also reading Tolkien, so I told my parents, I don't see the point of any of this. I'm not saying I don't believe, I'm not saying, but I certainly don't have this driving desire to be in it. And in fact, I think the church is this outdated institution and I don't see its relevance in my life. So I really want to not go to mass. So I made my confirmation because my parents were very clear that if I didn't, both my grandmothers would be very upset. So I did it out of love. And I guess when you do something out of love, you have to be very careful about the consequences of that because the good Lord's paying attention. So I left, and that was a good 20 years. I was away, atheist, agnostic, pagan, my own my one trip to the United Kingdom was to go to Glastonbury to go to Glastonbury tour, where the Holy Grail was laid to rest, etc. So, but I would say that there weren't a lot of answers there for me. And then in '96, my father passed away. I had a very good friend of mine that committed suicide. There were a lot of huge life events that occurred. And the answers for that, the worldview, the structure that could sort of encapsulate all that and still make sense of life and the love and that continues. Eventually, I found, quite by accident, nights out with friends. A friend of mine's friend was a local pastor, and then just I kept meeting individuals that kept allowing me to ask questions, and one thing led to another. Went back to Mass, ended up with a theology degree, and then incorporated that environmental background with that theology background, and then it goes from there.
Feels like you skipped over a lot of processes there. Just, ended up with theology degree.
Well, mindful of time, but sure. I mean, I started going back to Mass in '99, and it wasn't so much that the pastors that I met were so welcoming and would spend so much time with me, but they're also just joyful. They would have dinner parties and they would invite parishioners over, and it was just fun. But they explained things to me as an adult. First of all, they taught me things that no one ever taught me when I was in religious ed. It's one of the reasons I love teaching religious ed now, both to adults and to anyone, because there are so many awesome things about the history of Christianity that no one ever taught me. So once I started learning that and then doing my own deep dive as an engineer, what I wanted to do was sort of break it and find out why it either worked or didn't work. And I couldn't find out why it didn't work in my own experience. And then my friends and the pastors that I was getting to know were a little tired of me asking so many questions. So I figured I'd go to school and get an MA, and where I could ask all the questions that I wanted to. And it was around that time that the local diocesan newspaper asked me to write about ecology and faith. And at first I thought there would be very little to write about. And as we can see all these years later, it's a deep, deep well.
And so then you somehow became a knight commander with the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. What does that even mean?
It is a knighthood. It's an ancient knighthood from back in the days of the, oh God, what year was it? The 1400s, from the Crusades, when the order that eventually became that, after they had liberated Jerusalem, in their eyes, they had to reassemble government services, hospitals, food distribution, etc. And they focused on that. And they've been there since doing that. Hospitals, help, food, charity, that type of thing. So the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem is a knighthood. It is a papal order. I was nominated. My bishop had to approve of it. It has to go all the way up the chain of command. And so I am actually knighted. And it is but it's mostly a charitable institution that still provides daycare centers and clinics and food distribution and all of that to this day in the Holy Land. Dozens and dozens and dozens of schools. So it's really a great honor, but it's also an opportunity to provide direct aid and services to areas of the world that absolutely need it.
And it doesn't mean you're a Templar, does it?
No, but I can ride a horse into a church. I'm one of the few people that can do that.
Okay. I wonder if that'll be of practical use at some point. Maybe in the next book.
Maybe.
So yeah, I just wanted to touch on, and maybe this is an uncomfortable subject. You say so you're taking care of an elderly parent. So I'm assuming that's your mother then. And did you
Correct.
mention that she has Parkinson's at one point?
Correct. Yes.
Because my wife's a neurologist, and she has a lot of involvement with the local Parkinson's Society, and she's actually started a school program, a care program. Stands for, I always forget it, compassion, appreciation, respect, and empathy.
Wow.
So she kind of teaches them. She tries to teach them. It's difficult to primary school kids, but she tries to teach them kind of what it's like, to give them an appreciation of what it's like to be in that situation.
That's incredible. I would love to learn more about that. Offline, we'll have to chat more about that. But yeah, my mom was diagnosed not long after her mother passed away, my grandmother. And all the women in that side of the family lived to well in their hundreds with very little to no cognitive or physical decline. But my mom, 93 now, is doing well considering, but she's declining. We're entering the final stages of Parkinson's. Certainly being the primary caretaker, she lives with me, is difficult enough, but then you add a global pandemic into the fray. And right before COVID, my brother in California passed away suddenly, so she lost a son. So it was a very difficult year. So needless to say, a lot of my writing is on hold. Still doing some research for the sequel, etc. But my focus right now is that, and I will tell you that it has both helped me understand my faith more. The faith of the cross, of sacrifice for another person's good, but it also shows up in A Printer's Choice. I mean, there's a little side story of the main character taking care of a elderly woman, and part of that is sort of the beginnings of my writing career about this topic and about this issue, God willing, years down the road.
Well, I'm sorry for your loss. My wife and I both lost our fathers fairly recently as well.
Oh.
My dad died during the COVID lockdown in Canada, so I still haven't been back yet, to be honest. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's not a nice thing.
And then that's where the faith element comes in for me, is how do you explain that? How do you provide some worldview that isn't just discarding humanity and looking at people suffering as just this reality that you just have to put up with, or that doesn't challenge you in a way to grow, or that doesn't make you grow, or that doesn't help you respond in a loving way? That's, to me, is the core of where the intersection of faith and reason is, my engineering degree, my theology degree, and then ultimately the writing of fiction, and how can you play with all of that in a fictional setting just to have those conversations.
That's another topic, of course, we could spend a huge amount of time discussing.
Yes, it is.
But just before we move on to your book, then, and on that topic you just mentioned, I was just wondering, so as an engineer, a theologist, and a science fiction writer, I'm kind of curious what your perception of God is then, if you even dare to kind of attempt a perception.
Well, certainly I have had a lot of time with him, just him and me and my mom, as I struggle to take care of her, and at 2 a.m, and when I'm exhausted and she's devastated because she needs help from her son to do basic human functions. And somehow we get through it all and we ended up laughing. God is very much present in suffering. I mean, that's the Christianity's message to the world, is the cross. And the cross is God suffered with us. God enters suffering, uses suffering to redeem, to bring goodness out of it. He doesn't will suffering, and this is actually a conversation that goes on in The Printer's Choice, but he doesn't will suffering. He doesn't want suffering, but for reasons I could go into, from the Christian perspective about sin and the original sin and the fall of humanity, it exists. So the question is, how do you join that to the cross so you can bring good out of it? And I know that I become a better person taking care of my mom, less selfish, calmer, better organized, all of these qualities in my life that have made me a better person. And when she apologizes to me because she needs help with something and she feels bad, I say, Mom, you're making me a saint. And I joke about that, but that's the transition that you can go through. You can either enter into a situation of suffering, or it's thrust upon you and you can have one of two reactions. You can run and flee from it, or you can dive into it and grow because of it, and just bring love to it. Sacrificial, self-giving love. That's God. That's my experience of God. That's God. Is this the God that loves? God is love. That's Christian proclamation. That's 1 John. God is love. God is relationship. He's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He is pure relationship. We're meant to be in relationship. We're meant to love, but not just a limited form of love, a love that embraces all people in a very self-sacrificing way. That, in a nutshell, if I had to answer it in just a few sentences, is God.
Making it concise, a huge subject.
Well, it helps that I teach adults on the catechism.
So with your book, A Printer's Choice, which is your debut novel, published in 2018, and you've already discussed a little bit about the parts of you that have gone into it. So essentially, without trying to give too much away, the story features a Catholic priest who's basically called up to the space station to investigate a murder of someone who I will say was a quiet Catholic, if that's correct, a sort of a secret Catholic almost.
At least up there, yes.
Yeah, up there. Yeah. There is definitely the suggestion that religion is not accepted. This space station is essentially run by the engineers.
Correct. Yep. They run everything up there.
Which it does seem to have a fairly authoritarian structure, as my interpretation anyway. And so I found that the engineers felt very authoritarian, but the civilians actually welcomed him. And so there was this religion is not welcome here officially, but underneath that official decree, it was actually welcomed, at least by the people, some of the people anyway.
Yep. The builders especially. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you find, I mean, is this sort of, this feels like a bit of a dichotomy in a way that might stem from your own experiences, maybe between engineering and religion. Can you see that, or am I just way off?
Well, I think the engineers, there are different characters who are engineers. Some are more open and friendly with McClellan, the main character, than others, the priest. And the very fact that he's up there is a big deal, because you're not supposed to do any of this. And, just to be clear, I mean, I do think that the engineers have a point. Religious people can be crazy, and they have caused, there's been a lot of suffering in the world brought up by religious fundamentalism. And that is one of the side stories of one of the groups that make their appearance in world history, in the world history of Apprentice Choice. So their answer to that is, all right, well, we're not doing that as we go forward into space and we bring humanity out into the world. We're just not doing that. So none of that going forward. And so, that's sort of was my answer when I was 15, none of that going forward. And then it just crept up back into me, and I couldn't sort of keep it out, and I then embraced it. So that's kind of what the story is, where, their attitude was, let's keep it out. Then all of a sudden they have to get this priest with a law enforcement military background who has the technical skills to help understand how the murder could have happened and what happened and who was the murderer, because that was the first murder in outer space. And that was the other thing that the engineers were hoping wouldn't continue on with the human race in the new worlds, which is crime and suffering. And the book opens with, well, look how well that turned out.
Do you feel engineers can sometimes be perhaps overly optimistic in their structured outlook on things like this? Because I could fully see this kind of thought process is going into, and probably is even right now to some degree, going into the idea of extraterran colonies, etc. Do you feel that sometimes exists? This, I would guess, maybe I would call it a sort of either a naivety in a way, or an overly optimistic viewpoint to some degree from their perspective anyway.
Yeah, that's a huge question. So I would say, to answer that somewhat succinctly, is the secular notion of progress, which has a lot of truth behind its presuppositions, also has a lot of questions that it can't answer and doesn't answer and wants to ignore. And one of them is the problem of evil and the failures of individual humans and the selfishness that we individual humans have. I know I have the desires through our human evolution, et cetera, that can bring us to do something that's not right, to do something that harms others, to do something that ignores the suffering of others, those types of things. So the engineers are hopeful that they can create a new society where everything is just hunky-dory. And my critique is sort of a critique of a lot of the science fiction I read as a young boy, like Arthur C. Clarke, et cetera, is that that's not going to happen, because humans are humans, we're all people, and we bring with us our weaknesses and our foibles and our selfishness at times. So that's really sort of a fundamental arc of the story for a number of the engineers, to sort of learn that and reacquaint themselves, and then try to figure out, well, now what do we do about it? And that's based on a lot of my real world work as an engineer, and working with engineers in the design world of designing water pollution control infrastructure. I work heavily with the men and women who actually run them, and we train them and we provide technical and professional assistance to them. And they have a lot of legitimate concerns about the presuppositions of the design engineers about how they're going to build this thing, and then how does it get operated and maintained? Because then these guys have to operate and maintain it, and they're like, why do the engineers do this? Why did they make these assumptions? So there's some real world experiences that I get to draw from from my professional career.
So is that where the sort of the builders versus engineers kind of thing came from?
Correct. Yes.
There's a lot of religious issues in your book, and I'm not sure how much we can discuss too much about the book without giving too much of the story away. But you have sort of a backstory of Islam versus Christianity to a degree, which is what spawned the terrorist group in the history of your story, I think, if I'm reading that right, or at least was partially responsible. But eventually we're all going to have to live together with this, aren't we, if we go into space? And there's a lot of issues wrapped within this as well, because we have sort of factionation. So as we go into space, at the moment we have US versus China and Russia, and very literally at the moment, as they're both building their own space stations. Then we have the companies going in.
Yep.
And then eventually I'm pretty certain we're going to get individual ideologies going up into space as well and trying to stake their own claims. How do you feel that this is ever going to work? I mean, COVID has kind of shown us some of the flaws in that we have, we're building towards a globalism to some degree. And then COVID comes along and shows, well, no, that's not really going to work. You kind of have to have at least some nationalistic aspect, right? Yep. So how do you see, I mean, you've shown a very structured space station, but how would you kind of envision this in reality, perhaps?
Well, that's another great question. I can tell you've done this before because you're asking really, really great questions. So what I did with the backstories, and of course, with sequels and a series coming, you might learn more about the backstories that might challenge what was just presented as what everybody assumes in the first book. That said, what I tried to do, because I was writing in the near future, 2088, it's not a long time away, I needed, or at least I felt the need, as someone who really appreciates world building, I tried to connect the dots from the issues that we have today to what's going on in 2088. And then in the middle of that, I introduced this powerful AI 3D printing technology that just shifts everything a little bit. But if, the backstory of the 2030s and 2040s, when the climate crisis is really coming and ecological crises and wars are really becoming at the high point, you have people like the great minds of the world, the corporate holdings, as it talks about in one of those chapters, where they use their money to build the technology that they need to sort of, let's get into space as quickly as we can. What I don't do is get too much into the Russia, China, United States, India, European Space Agency type thing, because that's so complicated and you can go in so many different directions with that. At some point, if I, might have to do that more. But the real goal of the story is just to talk about, in the very near future, humanity reaches a point and really this sort of one world dictatorial global union is formed that kind of takes us on a different trajectory. The details and the nuances of that could be a series of books and backstories in and of itself. But I had to get from here to 2088 and do it in such a way that the technology that I introduce is understood to have developed out of that arc of history. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's why I love writing science fiction, because I get to pretend I know what's going to happen and have some fun with it.
I think I should take a lesson from you. You've put yours in 2088, which is far enough away that you probably won't be challenged too strongly. I have a near future one I said in 2045, which I drafted about 5 or 6 years ago, put in the drawer, come back, and it's clear everything's wrong. Even though it looked at the time like this was a good a direction that the world was going.
Wait, you never know. I mean, that was my criticism of the movie version of 2010. And, with this very hardcore Cold War, filmed in the Reagan era type thing and then in the 2090s or early 2010, it didn't seem that way, but maybe we're going back in that direction. Who knows? Yeah, near future stuff can be dangerous. I thought 2088 was a little too soon. I needed a date where there was a certain planetary alignment at a certain window around around Easter, or at least so many months after the beginning of the story. And the only time that happened was in 2088. So I had to go with that.
So there's another bit of excellent research you've done. You did seem to do an awful lot of research in this book, which really shows through well.
Well, thank you.
It has a feel of being real. So I was wondering, you mentioned the global union. I did want to bring that up briefly because it doesn't seem like you present them very positively in the story. Is that just me reading something into it, or is that kind of the way you were looking at it?
Well, you got to have some bad guys. A little bit of a bias on my end. Now I remember I work for the government. My experience with governments on the national and international level, i.e., even the United Nations, it can be a bit. They could be doing the very things that I criticized the engineers for doing in 2088, which is sort of pretending that if we just do A, B, and C, all the problems are going to go away, instead of creating a culture where individuals are born into a world where they understand that suffering is a reality, and the answer to suffering is love, not bigger government, not dictatorial answers to questions. There's a whole question going on right now about, do you force people to take vaccines or do you persuade them? And there's a lot in the moral theologian worlds, the answer that moral theologians would provide is you have to persuade, you can't force. You can't violate someone's free will. And that's the whole point. That's the whole, the theme in A Printer's Choice is about choice and free will and understanding what free will is. And free will can never be violated. You can try, government can. And so I make the global union feel that they have to do it because of the eco crises of the day. And the only way to solve things has to be through a hard-nosed government response. Now, maybe when I write a sequel, I'll write some backstory that'll make them seem a little better. Who knows?
Might be difficult. You never know. Giant absolute power and all that. I did want to talk about the free will issue a little bit, because that was clearly a big part of, especially during the climax. And specifically what you said, like there's a lot of issues going on right now where it feels like, well, in your discussion, you bring up it's kind of the notion, without giving a lot away, that the creator has given free will, even though he knows, let's say, the most effective or proper paths forward. He gives the creations the free will to choose which paths to take. And now we have in our current world a lot of parallels to that. You mentioned vaccinations. We also have with big tech, for example, if I give them the benefit of the doubt, it looks like they don't trust us to, discuss things in a reasonable way, or that it might hurt people if misinformation gets out. Now, that's in the best case scenario of looking at them. I have other views about what their motives might be, but your book, I mean, from that perspective, you really does seem to be very timely. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, because we seem to be really getting into these issues of free will now very heavily.
We always have, though. I think that's a fundamental in history. What is the role of the community versus the individual? What is the role of the child to the parents? So there's two things that come out of that final conversation. Not that come out of it, but two satellites that orbit around the issue of free will is trust and relationship. And trust is a very big part of helping someone use their free will well. And relationship and helping people understand that their relationship is not just, their best friend or their lover or their spouse or whatever, but we are meant to be in relationship with all people. And so that requires sometimes us to do things that are not in our own personal best interest. And you can take, I think, every issue that we have in play right now, and you can superimpose that philosophy of you have to sacrifice. You don't have to. You don't have to. You can just be a selfish person the rest of your life and see how that goes and see how happy you are at the end. So the question about free will is one that is an absolute right, because it's from at least the Christian perspective. It's just we're made with free will. But then now how do you use it to be the best person that you can? And to be the person you're meant to be, and ultimately happy and peaceful.
And anyone who's tried raising a child, or who remembers their teenage years, most likely can understand the difficulties there. I guess the last topic I wanted to discuss from your book really was artificial intelligence itself, which is something that comes up without getting too much into the specifics. So what's your opinion then on the sort of status of artificial intelligence? I mean, there's a lot of discussion that goes on. Can we, can't we create a proper intelligent artificial intelligence or a general intelligence? And then perhaps, recent deep mind advancements and the direction of their work, if you've followed any of that. So what is your impression on it? Do you think maybe we'll develop an AI sooner rather than later, or it's not possible?
If you asked me about a year and a half ago, I would have said it's possible and maybe even likely. But then because of the book, a number of individuals who are engaged in the topics of AI have either reached out or provided me documents, or I've just my own research. And now I'm not 1,000% sure that what we would call intelligence is something that we can artificially replicate. Now, in the story, and this is early this is like the second chapter, so I'm not giving too much away. I don't refer to it as artificial intelligence. I refer to it as deep intellect, to try to even make it more kind of advanced and out there. So it's something even further down the road, or something deeper, quite literally, than just AI. And what that is and how that developed is for speculation further in the story. But and one of the individuals I've done some research with is a physicist and computer scientist who's a priest in the Archdiocese of Boston. And because Boston is a big city and it's a big setting in the story, and he was fascinated by we had so many conversations. So he helped me put it this way, Edwin. In the sequel, the choice that is presented and taken is going to be one that is going to be critiqued from two different viewpoints. That was the right thing, or that was the wrong thing. And that a lot of what you're asking will be explained there. I don't have all the answers to that now, but stay tuned.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. You do mention with the builders and the robbers and whatnot, the loss of jobs, which is obviously a
Yep.
big concern.
And just if I can, for the listeners, the robbers is the name for the robots, the androids of the world, and they were called robbers by the builders because they're taking all their jobs from them.
Right. And so, what level of, let's say, self autonomy did you envision them to have?
As you know from Apprentice Choice, they don't have a huge role in the story. You sort of just needed them because you're writing about 2088, and everybody expects androids to be walking around. But I did need them for certain aspects of the story. They will become more of a character, as it were, of a force in the sequel.
All right. But they are advanced enough to, let's say, do some of the jobs that now we're afraid of losing, for example, maybe auto drive cars and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say that they have artificial intelligence. The printers have deep intellect. So they're probably where we would expect them to be. But whether or not that's the right thing, there's certainly a sense that people don't warm up to the robbers.
Have you ever thought then, in the process of writing the book, how some of the jobs might have changed? Because one of the discussions I've been hearing, obviously, is with, for example, the vast numbers of truck drivers. And if you bring in auto drive trucks, then a lot of those people are potentially out of work. And some of the discussion involves what might they do. I have some ideas myself, but I wonder, did you have any thought on what might have happened in that case?
So, and that's that kind of touches on the issue that we were talking about earlier in the environmental realm, which is, what do you do with everybody who's earning a paycheck and for their family that work in the fossil fuel industry right now? And so there's this notion of a just transition. It's a transition that provides a level of justice to individuals who are working in that field now. Certainly, when you think about large-scale, complex construction in space, it does seem to lend itself more towards automation than human interaction. But then, when you watch the astronauts working in space, you begin to see a sense of the need for human minds and to kind of be there and do what they need to do. In the Printer's Choice, there's this sense that you got to give these people jobs because there's so many unemployed people on Earth and they want to escape Earth. So you got to give them something to do, but then that's answered by the efficiencies of automation. And so that's where part of the tension builds up between the builders and the engineers. So I think they will be needed. I think humanity will be needed in construction and in space to do things, but there'll always be a tension there. And that's part of the fun of writing about something like this, is because anytime you have humans' intentions with other humans, you get to explore some really cool philosophical, theological issues that may even involve solving a crime.
Yeah, it is one of those issues, isn't it? The boundary between the complexity of human decision making in the environment of space, for example, and how much can robots actually do, or are they just going to be tools?
No, but these are all, I mean, so there are a lot of issues that really are all kind of fundamentally connected. Is humans are making choices, and what we create and how we create it and what powers we give them and what expectations we hold of them, how we treat each other, how we treat, if you can get AI, and if you can get maybe even something beyond AI, is there a sense of not necessarily, maybe not personhood, but a theological word, agency? You treat, there's a whole world out there of animal rights. Well, if you have created something and maybe it replicates itself and it creates something even more intelligent, and now it has a sense of, one could argue, agency, would you treat it worse than a dog? And so the where we are at as a species in this time and place, with or without COVID and all the political trauma that's going on, and even without the environmental issues, we're actually, with all of those factored in, we have some really important choices to make. And I think we're all going to be making them slightly different. And so it's going to be an interesting few years. And to me, that's where I think science fiction, traditional hardcore, good science fiction that I loved and read as a boy, I think it sort of didn't address those types of issues. Maybe because they thought we wouldn't have those issues because humanity was going to evolve out of them, or technology would provide the level of progress that we would need to bring it sufficient joy to the world that no one would have issues with each other. But I think, as we're seeing today, that's not the case. So now let's explore it and figure out what can we do with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's perhaps going to be more than a few years, a decade or two even. Yeah, I think maybe they didn't explore those issues because it's so hard to actually predict such a circumstance arising, like with all of those decisions and issues coming at us at the same time. And I think maybe in those simpler periods, like you're saying, of Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, you kind of, when you envision the future, you sort of look at one path, maybe two, but we're being hit by a dozen different paths at the same time, kind of the singularity of Ray Kurzweil. And I think it's really hard to predict what it's going to be like before you get to that phase. Like now that we're here, we're like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Who would have known? Yeah, and that's why I think, to your point earlier, I mean, even 2088 is close enough where I worry about, someday, maybe 5 years from now, it gets picked up for a movie, and then it's made 2 years later. So now you're in like almost 2030, which is only 50 years away. I mean, you look back at movies made in the 50s and 60s, you really need to be careful with technology. And, I do the best I can to kind of futurize, to plot ahead to see where we could be and what could happen. Rocket propulsion and ships, spacecraft and space transport hasn't advanced too much. And I think most NASA engineers that I've spoken with agree with that. I focus on one piece of technology that I really push to the limit, and everything else is just sort of advancing along at a more reasonable pace. But that's not what I'm writing about. Isn't about tech. It is because I love science fiction, but I'm really more interested in the bigger human philosophical questions that arise out of the human species confronted with new realities and having to learn to live together.
And those are the stories that persevered through the ages, basically. And like you say, though, the tech is kind of leading us into those issues, isn't it? Now, I think we kind of ignored them for a while, for several decades, as we sort of moved along comfortably post World War II a little bit. Well, what looks comfortable now. And the tech is sort of leading us to really kind of force us to think of these issues now in a real serious way.
The 20th century had some huge existential moments with technology, starting with the sinking of the Titanic, and then the weaponization of chemicals and other mechanical units in World War I, and then the atomic age. So where there was this sense in the 19th century that technology was going to be this wonderful thing, and you had Shelley writing Frankenstein, and you had H.G. Wells writing The Food of the Gods, putting a cautionary tone on that, but that was just sort of, they were just kind of scary stories. There was still the sense of technology was going to save humanity. And ultimately, technology is moral neutral. It's how it's applied. It's how we choose to use it. And it comes down again to choice and free will. So really the struggle for humanity is not a technological one. It's a human one.
That's why it's so important that we all have a voice in it. And this kind of leads back to both the free will relating to free speech as well. Because if that's shut down, then we don't get to have this dialogue amongst all of humanity. We only get, to hear the voices of a few people.
Especially if it is true dialogue, where one is open to the voice of another. And social media is one of the greatest cancers. It's one of the greatest opportunities to learn and grow. I mean, I've connected with so many people through the modern technology, and certainly my environmental career. I helped build the global Catholic climate movement with the use of Skype and social media, etc. But it isolates us. It is easy to compartmentalize this picture and this name. There's not a real human being, but is just this adversary that I'm going to beat down because they said something stupid. And it's not a loving, open dialogue of fraternity and true relationship. It's something other than that. So the use of social media was seen as this great, wonderful thing. And computers in general. There's a great video of Arthur C. Clarke talking. I don't know if it was a promo video or it was a documentary or what, but he's talking to a father and a young boy, and they're sitting at a kind of a big desktop, one of the early desktop computers. And Arthur C. Clarke was rightly saying that, to the young boy, when you're an adult, you'll be able to go onto your computer and buy movie tickets and book airfare and order food at the restaurant, do all of these things that are true. But then you have the blight of pornography and human trafficking, and you have all and people, families, friends arguing with each other on social media. So again, it's the technology has a great use for it and has a great opportunity, but it can be used wrong. And how it gets used and why it gets used wrong is not a technical issue. It's not a scientific issue. It's a human issue. And I would say a philosophical and theological issue.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's basically the age-old issue, isn't it? I mean, the double-edged sword. You build something, it can be used for good and evil.
Hammers make great weapons, but you can't build a house without them.
So I wanted to ask a couple questions that I ask of all my guests. And so one of them is, which one of the many issues facing humanity at the moment would you be most inspired to base a story around? Now, you have based it around the discussion of free will, so perhaps that's your answer. But if we think of some of the challenges that we're trying to face, perhaps with technology.
No, and I think that's a great question, because in the sequel, I want to really work more on the divisions that are in the world of 2088, both on Earth, but in the orbits as well, and how the sense of the original designers and engineers of the New World thought that we wouldn't have to deal with this. Well, now they know they do. And or at least some of them know they do. So there's going to be different viewpoints about how to go forward and what to do. And like I mentioned earlier, that the whole issue of what the sort of the answer to the question that was asked at the end of the book is going to be critiqued and endorsed, and there's going to be a lot of that on various fronts. So what I would like to write about, and will plan to write about in the sequel, is shifting, not shifting from, but adding on to the discussion of free will to the issue of relationship.
And so this is related, but again, thinking of all the various issues that we face, which one concerns you the most and would be the one that you hope we get right moving forward?
The breakdown of relationship.
So that's basically the human question, as it were.
Yes, the sense of, we pride ourselves in so many different ways on the progress that we've made as a species and as cultures in the West and around the world. And we should, because we've done quite a bit of good stuff, but we've tribalized ourselves. We've returned to a sense of tribal warfare, this us versus them. It's such a cancer in the human person, and it has been always. And it is so apparent today. And it's not, it's apparent, but it's not apparently not apparent. So that needs to be explored and fleshed out. And that's the type of thing that I would like to write more about, while telling a fun sci-fi story with a murder that needs to be solved.
And lots of robots and
stations and cool gadgets doing all kinds of wild things. Yep.
All right. So now we move on to this part of the show we call the Revenge of the Muse. And so prior to this interview, I sent you 4 randomly rolled story cubes that represented the categories of hero, action, setting, and science fiction element. And I asked you to prepare a short introduction to a story using those cubes as guides. And just for those listening at home who'd like to try their hand at this, the images will be available on alternatefutures.co.uk in the podcast section. And so you've asked me to read this so that you don't self-edit too much. And so I'll just give it a read right now, and then we can discuss sort of your thought processes on the cubes. The St. Michael Emitter by W.L. Patenaude. Aaron Archer slipped off the damp stone of St. Michael's Tower. His feet and left arm clawed and grasped in the night, struggling to prevent a 3-story fall. He'd have cried for help had he not felt the quick hands of the Royal Marine assigned to his mission. The hands held him, and Archer cursed with relief. He was safe, and so was the particle emitter held securely in his free hand. "No falls on my watch," the wiry Marine said, hauling the physicist upward. "But I'll throw you over myself if you drop it." "It's safe," Archer said, gasping as he assisted with the climb back over the parapet, his feet now resting on a makeshift wooden platform. "But damn it, I dropped your torch. Smashed from the sound of it." Archer rubbed at a pain in his wrist, breathed in the damp night air, and returned to work. A hot light flared to his left, then dimmed and flickered. He looked up. In the light of a match, he made out the faint smirk of the Royal Marine, Lance Corporal Matthew Reynolds. "You owe me 2 torches, Reynolds said. "Guess we do this old school." "Fancy that," Archer said, almost laughing. "Setting up some of the most powerful, complex technology on Earth by matchlight. Hell, who carries matches anymore?" "Cigar smokers," Reynolds said. "I brought one for both of us, in case these gadgets work." "They'll work." Archer stepped back onto the parapet. Carefully, he screwed the last of the 4 emitters in a holding bracket, which Reynolds had secured onto the tower's eastern wall, the side facing London. "They have to work," the physicist said to himself. Below, a roar came from the village of Glastonbury. The crowd that had gathered that morning was unaware of the global plan underway, of what was happening in the tor and tower that loomed above them. Across the continents, millions like them were praying, rioting, looting, or numbing themselves with drugs and alcohol, terrified of the coming of the alien craft. Reynolds adjusted his earpiece. "Tor perimeter secure," he said. "You focus on the job. I'm not wasting any cigars." Archer connected the emitter to the nuclear generator hidden in the tower's base, then smiled as indicators signaled a satisfactory diagnostic check. Reynolds peered over the parapet for a better view. "If you ask me," he said, shaking his head, "these seem bloody small against what those bastards did to the moon's bases, even if we have thousands of them." "Hundreds of thousands," Archer said, as he worked, wondering how he could explain the physics of the plan. He settled for a review of the basics. "Our visitors did us a favor by attacking the moon first. We learned quite a bit about their weapons, and they are weapons, no matter what some of our politicians are saying. So unless something changes, these emitters will do the job, reverse the initial carrier waves, and deflect enough power to save us all. Maybe enough to return a good deal of energy back up." "Now you're talking," Reynolds said. The emitter signaled that it had connected with the 3 mounted on the tower's other walls, as well as with the network being installed on hills, steeples, and towers the world over. In the once friendly heavens, what looked like a star drifted over the plains of Somerset, glowing brighter, now enough for the tower to cast a faint shadow. The crowds roared again. "Well," Archer said, "this is it." Reynolds tensed, saying nothing. Then, to himself, Archer whispered, "Come on, let's give the people something to cheer." So, how did you find the experience of writing this?
Well, ultimately fun once I settled on where I was. Yeah, I mean, so I went, I have the four images. One was a target, practice target, and then there was the image of a guy hanging, and then there was the chalice, which I initially looked at as the Holy Grail, and then the science fiction element was sort of a beam coming down and blowing something up. So I struggled. At first I was thinking, well, the Holy Grail, the Holy Land, and so I was thinking of, Jerusalem, but anything I did for a very short period, a very short piece that you asked me to write would have just had too much like current events to deal with. And then I was thinking of the character as a target. So ultimately, I just went with the easy, calling him Archer. But I do think it was kind of neat that he was an archer and he was behind a parapet setting up a weapon. Then for location, as I mentioned when we were speaking before the podcast began, is I have a very strong affinity for the United Kingdom and for Britain. And one of the places I spent the most time was Glastonbury. So I thought, I know, well, that's where the Holy Grail was traditionally, King Arthur laid it to rest or found it or whatever. So I never mentioned the Holy Grail or a chalice. I just used that historical, mythological, legendary place. Well, a real place that has a legendary attachment to the Holy Grail. And then, of course, the laser strike. So then I just sort of took it from there. And so in 600 words, try to get a little bit of characterization, a little bit of what's happening and the tension around it on a global and just that sort of microscopic place. I will say that as I was writing it, there was a couple of scenes in A Printer's Choice that sort of mirrored this, where it was the Marine and the, flashbacks with Marine and etc. But it was just, I loved writing it because I just kind of closed my eyes and saw myself back on the Tor underneath St. Michael's Tower and looking down on that beautiful village.
Two of them you took quite literally, and two of them you really stretched on, didn't you? I mean, it's perfectly fine. You're the first person I think who's used the hero image to be in the hero's name, which is very creative. I liked how you did that. And yeah, I would have never gone where you did with the chalice. I mean, it looks like a Holy Grail, and I thought of that when I rolled it for you. But yeah, I would have never put that together. So that's really interesting.
Well, it was a great exercise. I mean, no one has ever asked me to write, a pretty solid introduction to a story, or even as it were a short story. And I have to thank you, Edwin, because now I'm thinking, hey, that might make the great prelude forward to a novel. So you may have just added another project to my list of things to do.
Well, I'm sorry, not sorry, because yeah, I'd love to see that.
Well, the thing is, so one of the things I learned in writing Apprentice Choice as a writer is, you have to provide enough information so there's a sense of believability, but there's also the reader never feels like they're forgetting something. And this was actually one of the questions that you asked in the questions you asked me to fill out earlier, which is on research.
And that's for the author's insights in Indie Book Showcase.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd been to Glastonbury. So I remembered that the tower, which is the remnants of, an ancient monastery, the tower is all that stands, but the tower doesn't have a roof. It's just four walls that loom up. So I'm thinking, okay, how many readers are going to know they need something to stand on? But so you add that little line in there somewhere, he's standing on a makeshift wooden shelf, so that if there were someone that knew or was from Glastonbury and remembered standing there looking straight up into the sky, that would make them feel a little better about the ability of the author to tell a story.
That's awesome. Well, thanks very much for that. And I think we're at the end of the interview now. So I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you. And then give you a chance to plug your next books, any books you're working on, any events you're attending, where people can find you online.
Sure. Well, the website for the novel, The Printer's Choice, is aprinterschoice.com. And my Twitter at Bill Patenaude, at Bill Patenaude RI. So at BILL PATENAUDE RI, and also at WL Patenaude Instagram. So right now, that's the book. And if you want to read about more of the faith ecology side of things, my blog is catholicecology.net, all one word. So right now, events, I don't have quite a lot planned, if anything. A, because, there's just still this lingering global pandemic thing. But B, right now my focus is taking care of my mom. So I would have a lockdown even if hadn't been a lockdown or whatever. I will say that story, though, is going to be a story that I will write about, non-science fiction, just, a story about a child who learns about life with the unexpected reality of being the sole caretaker of a parent. So this is something that you'll read about eventually. But I am working on the sequel for Printer's Choice. Having built the world, that's one of the things about a first in a series of a science fiction. You have to explain a lot about the world. I've done that. So now I can, launch into a pretty fast story. I'm really looking forward to writing that. I'm working with two great orbital mechanics specialists that actually do work for NASA, back to the United States Marines for some battle sequences on Earth, etc. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. So eventually, when the time is right, that will be available as well. But right now, apprenticeschoice.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for joining me as well.
You've been a joy. This is the invitation. You're very kind. You asked great questions. So I think you should give a course on how to do podcasts because you do it very well.
Well, hopefully I'll get to that stage at some point.
Another thing to add to your list of things to do.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thanks again. And we'll talk to you hopefully again sometime.
Thanks, Edwin.
Thank you for listening. Transcripts of this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk, as are the StoryCube images and original story openings written by my guests. If you've enjoyed this, why not share it with friends and other sci-fi fans you know? If there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Finally, if you'd like to support this podcast financially, you can do so on Subscribestar. Just search for Alternate Futures. There you can find extra discussions and information that hasn't made it into the final edit. And thank you once again for listening. I hope you'll join us on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.